So today, we're going to start the presentation off by going through JBoss Windup, kind of the concepts behind JBoss Windup, and then kind of just get into general migration methodology. And we can get as technical as you guys want during the presentation. So if you have questions, you can stop me, let me know, or if you have them at the end, we can stay late, look at the bits. So, what leads to migration anyway, and what makes it difficult, right? The traditional problems in large enterprises is that you have a lot of applications. So we're talking massive enterprise. You may have 10 years of applications that have accumulated, and I've been in organizations that have hundreds of applications. So they're stuck on proprietary software because there wasn't open source alternatives. The effort to migrate has become too large now. Hundreds of applications. If you think about it, you have very diverse implementations that have been created over time, and that's really primarily because really old app servers didn't have JEE standards. So every app server produced their own version of X, transaction manager, or timer services, this or that finally got added to the spec over time. The problem is, before there was spec, everybody wrote their own, and everybody took advantage of those implementations. And with large enterprises, a lot of times the system matter experts are no longer with the business. So, a lot of you probably have been in that situation where you go into a customer and, unfortunately, the SME that wrote the app is moved on. So, this is kind of the idea. In the past, migrating to JBoss from proprietary platforms, it's been kind of a promise of savings, but really there's a lot of upfront work that needs to be done. Right before there was a tool, you'd have to kind of go by hand through your source code looking for areas, or you'd build and deploy and it would fail, and you'd build and deploy and it would fail, and you'd kind of struggle through, right? So the idea behind Windup is to cut down this initial investment that you have to spend just trying to figure out what it's going to take to migrate you to JBoss, right? So if you look at that blue, if that was just the analysis to get you to JBoss, you can see how it diminishes savings. And if we can chop that light blue off, obviously that would be ideal. Make it as cheap as possible to move. So proposing a problem, you currently use WebSphere or WebLogic, and you're tasked with moving to JBoss. You're unfamiliar with the application. Maybe you've just come on board, or you're actually tasked with migrating all of your applications, and maybe you only are responsible for developing one or two. So where do you begin? How long will it take you to migrate? How long will it take you to even determine how long it will take you to migrate? And is the migration effort as a whole going to be worth the cost of the savings that you'll get in the end? That's the big question for everyone. So even if it took you 40 hours, like a whole man week, in order to pull down the source code, go through it line by line, and just to figure out what the migration effort is going to be, and along the way you're looking for vendor-specific code, databases, and queues, and other vendor-specific configurations that you'll have to move, that's what's going to make up your effort, right? So with 20 applications, that becomes 800 hours. If you consider it's going to take 40 hours, and we have some large enterprise that are running over 250 apps, and that works out to about 5 man years. So you can see how that doesn't really scale to figure out where do you even begin, right? So migrating to JBoss just really is promoting JEE standards, upgrading frameworks along the way. Increasing the speed and reliability often occurs when you're migrating, and that's for a number of reasons, right? You're migrating to JBoss, but you're a lot of times if you're coming from a legacy platform, you're also migrating from older versions of Java to newer versions, and they've had some enhancements there. Also just some transaction management things, startup of the server, a lot of that is just increasing speed when you move into JBoss. We've had tests of migrated apps running in JBoss that were running in WebSphere that have outperformed by a volume of like 7 times, and it's just general transactional type of things. Understanding the legacy application at a high level, and you're creating standards that should be implemented across the enterprise. So a lot of times if apps have been created over time, they may not all follow the same standards, so you look for areas that you can improve standards. what this slide is showing is kind of the things that you'll come across along the way. You have proprietary libraries that may be embedded in the application, transaction managers, injection frameworks, timer services, thread pools. These are all things that you'll see from WebLogic and WebSphere that are very vendor specific for legacy implementations. Proprietary configurations, almost every container has their own WAR and EAR configuration that adds some sort of enhancement over the general descriptors that are part of JEE. You also have service locators, so initial context, JMX locators, these type of things where you're looking a service up from the server generally get registered into different places in the application server. Web service implementations, for some reason, you have WebLogic, I believe was actually WebSphere, just took access to and renamed the package structure. Why they did it, I don't know, but so you'll see a lot of that kind of stuff in older implementations. EJB descriptors, and a lot of deprecated Java code ends up coming out if you're moving from a really legacy version of Java. So before we had Windup, I'm from the Red Hat consulting side, so it was going in, looking at applications, and trying to come up with some sort of migration estimate. And over time, we kind of developed the idea that instead of looking at the server and the application, and you have to check out the source code and all of this stuff that would take a long time, instead we're just going to look at the application, because the application itself is going to tell you most of the stuff that would have to be set up in the server. Things that you will not find out from the application, such as clustering configurations and these type of things, the operations team can really easily provide to you just with a general questionnaire. And also getting access to all the application source repositories. You can imagine if I was tasked with estimating the migration of 250 apps, getting access to every source repository for 250 applications would be probably a disaster and extremely hard to do. So the idea is, with Windup, we'll start with the deployable. Windup takes one or more EAR, JAR, WAR files, any R files, right, zip files, and it recursively profiles the resources. So primarily we're looking at JSP, XML, Java classes, and we're basically pattern matching on these things. Once we find blacklisted classes, for example, in Java classes, we're looking at the import statements. That may give us some information that we can then go a little deeper and a little deeper. We then kind of generate that into a 10,000-foot view of the application so that you as a migrator, you're not stuck in the weeds going through source code. You can actually see what the application is made up of and then drill down into the relevant resources therein. And Windup itself is really a platform for migration. So the idea being, if you have other technologies that you're interested in incorporating into Windup, out of the box we have the JSP, XML, and class interrogators, but you can add your own. We're looking in the future of adding things like rules engine, migration tools, and things like that. So I'm going to actually run Windup now so you guys can see what it looks like. So in a migration, generally, you come into an organization or you yourself in the organization have a number of EAR files, right? You have a number of EARs or WARs, whatever you're deploying with. And this is really your starting point with Windup. The idea being, me as an implementer, I'm going into another organization that I don't know. And if I saw this would exactly be my starting point. I would know nothing about the application. So the first thing I'm going to do is run Windup against the app. And then we can kind of go through that report, and together, hopefully, you guys can get an understanding of the tool. So Windup is a command line tool. It has a shell script that comes with it. Let me zoom in here. So you can see that there's a JBoss Windup shell script, and I'll just show what this is really quickly. There's a couple of parameters. These are all documented at windup.jboss.org. You'll see that there's a couple of parameters: fetch, remote, false. I can set this to true. Actually, I will set it. Well, we'll set it to false. This is. I'll talk more about that parameter in a few minutes. Java packages is the main parameter that you have to worry about. Windup is primarily going to look at your source code. So what I mean there is, if you're making use of proprietary software, so you're making use of APIs that are proprietary to WebLogic or WebSphere or Jetty or Resin or any number of other servers, you're the one that's using it, right? You're making use of it in your software because your business layer, your front end layer, it's either making use of those APIs or it's not. And if it's not making use of the APIs, we can assume that it would deploy onto JBoss. Most frameworks are going to start, servlet containers and everything are going to start with your source, and then you're using the proprietary frameworks along the way. So as long as we're scanning your application, specifically your classes, then we should actually be pretty, we're going to actually do a lot of things along the way here. So if we find that you're using proprietary source, we actually go through and decompile the source code and then walk the abstract syntax tree for the Java classes. So it's important that we only decompile your source code. And then the input parameter is either a folder that contains a number of ear files, or it is a direct reference to an ear file. There's also another parameter in here that you can provide, which is -source equals true. And if you provide source equals true, it'll run against a folder of source code rather than the compiled code. Out of the box, it defaults to compiled. You'll have to, out of the box, we ship with support for JAD as far as decompilers. So you'll want to make sure that you add JAD to your path. So whatever, either Windows or Unix or whatever. And at that point, all we have to do is run Windup. So Windup is going to start up. It's going to load its rules and start going through. And now we're done with the report. So we've generated a folder, and this folder is the Windup report. So to get an idea of the application, now it's as simple as kind of walking through this report. Really quickly, I'm going to kind of go through this, and I'll walk around. So this part of the report is at a very high level explaining the areas that would have to change or the areas of interest in the application. In other words, we're also showing the amount of effort that we estimate the application to be. So this is estimating 43 story points. Story points are agile methodology units of work, and they can be applied to, a story point for me may be an hour, a story point for a more junior person may be 3 hours, right? You can kind of play around with that depending on how you're staffing the project and also how much migration experience they have, right? That's going to decrease over time. But this is really where the work is. It's identifying the classes that are making use of things that will not deploy on JBoss or could be problematic in JBoss. You'll also see that along the way, Windup is also classifying resources. And this is a very helpful thing because very quickly you can look at an application and go, oh, this application is using JMS and it's using, it's an ear application. And this is WebLogic specific. And you can then focus on those resources. And also, like I said before, this is giving kind of a 10,000-foot view of the application. You're not getting stuck in the weeds, checking out the software and going file by file. This is very clearly explaining what's important here. You can also see that it's breaking down the effort per resource, and we can drill down into that resource to get a deeper look. And it's doing in-browser syntax highlighting along the way. You can also see that Windup in this case is classifying the resource at the top, but it's also providing links to relevant information. So along the way, Windup said, oh, I recognize that this is a WebLogic JMS descriptor, and therefore I can generate a JBoss messaging configuration from this descriptor. And that's what Windup has done here. So this link is actually to generated content from Windup. Log event queue, if we drill down into here, this is the JBoss messaging way to create log event queue. You can also see that we're pulling relevant information to the top of the 10,000-foot view so that you very quickly can see, okay, well, within this EJB XML, we're actually making use of 1 MDB and 2 session beans. And then you can drill down into that and actually see that it's highlighting it at the top here so that you can quickly kind of scan through the application. I can just find where that is. Kind of going forward here, we also have support for the EJB configurations so that it can actually generate JBoss equivalents. So this was the EJB configuration for WebLogic. Windup applied a simple XSLT and produces the JBoss version. And then you can also see that here we're doing Java classes. These are areas that are causing this to show up in the Windup report. We're not showing Java classes that don't match blacklist patterns. We're only showing the Java classes that do. You're not distracted by 1,000 Java classes. You see exactly what's relevant to the migration. You'll see here a heat map that describes how much of the actual class would have to change or the areas within the class. If you flip this on its side, this would be, okay, so there's changes in the first 20%, second 20%, third 20%. It breaks it down into 5 quadrants. So, and if we drill down into this, you can see that Windup has done a couple of things here. Number one, it's classified the resource as a WebLogic application lifecycle listener through pattern matching. It's also pulled relevant documentation that would help you migrate this to JBoss. So you could click into these reports and actually see some relevant articles that may give you background into doing the migration. And if we go down here, you can see notifications. Notifications are areas of the class that this was brought up in our report because we're doing an import of an application context. All of these are WebLogic specific. And we can click those and drill down into the report. You can see within the source code, which is also highlighted, that we have a couple of things explaining why the line is highlighted. And then it can go further and actually provide inline hints for what to do in this particular case. So this is WebLogic specific, remove it, right? The nice thing about that is we've added the ability to do GitHub Markdown. And so you can actually provide very detailed explanations of how to migrate. So in this case, you're using a method parameter. It is an application lifecycle event. In order to migrate that, here's two different options, also syntactically highlighted. You can see here that this is doing an initial context lookup. Along the way, Windup is actually resolving variables, which makes it a lot easier to write rules for. So it knows that this context is actually a JavaX naming context, and it's using the method lookup, and therefore is explaining that you have to make sure that this is the same for JBoss as well. That's the pattern. You can see that it's just repeated here. We're making use of a non-catalog logger, and here's how you would replace that. Replace that with log4j, right? That's container agnostic. And then with each archive, it actually breaks the effort down even further. So you can see that this archive is there's only a few things within this. And we can also see a couple of other things as well. So Windup has identified this as a vendor-specific jar. Specifically, if you had no context over a bunch of jars that were sitting in an ear file or a war file, this is a very easy way for you. It pulls relevant information to the top of the report so you can see what it is. In this case, it is log4j 1.2.6. If we actually had flipped that fetch remote to true, Windup would have said, oh, wait, this doesn't have a Maven POM with it because it's an old version of log4j, and it will go fetch the Maven POM from Maven Central for you and give you further context information. So links to the actual project site, for example, more detailed descriptions, things that Maven tends to provide. So that is Windup. Windup also, along the way, produces an Excel document. Because this is a static report, and it's really, there's no way for you to really adjust this effort, we actually generate an Excel version of this that you can then go and adjust the migration effort over time. So if you know, hey, this went a little light on this, you could add migration effort to each jar as you're going through the report. Windup adds its effort and adds these inline hints through simple XML. It doesn't require that you add Java. If you want to contribute to Windup, it's simply probably 3 to 5 lines of XML can produce very detailed inline documentation. All of that XML is actually present in the rules folder of Windup. So you can pull down Windup and then actually modify the rules. If you see something that's not covered in real time, and without recompiling the application, you can just relaunch Windup, look at the report, make sure that it's added the area that you're interested in. And you can do that by going into the extensions folder. We actually will pick up anything that's a .windup.xml. And if I open this, we can take a look at the rules themselves. So this is what Windup's rules look like. It's simple XML. You have a pipeline. You're telling it the type of file that you want it to run against. And then you have a Java classification, and it's saying, hey, if there is this regular expression matched within the class, then I know that this Java class is a testing extension framework. All of the rules are written this way. If you want to look at examples of how the rules are written for the, if you're trying to create a rule that looks like another rule, all of our rules are packaged here in the base folder. So we can drill down into Windup. You can see all the Java rules here, specifically maybe JDK. Well, we'll look at the WebLogic ones. You can see that here's one of the more advanced ones we actually saw earlier. So this is the GitHub Markdown defined here. That's going to get rendered as HTML. And all it took in order to do that is a regular expression that defined where I wanted to put this in. And then you can actually restrict that further using source type. So you have import and type where I'm calling a constructor. So all of these things are available through the Windup website. Specifically, the GitHub wiki gives pretty good documentation on these.
Earlier you showed contextual information pointing to articles saying how you might deal with this kind of object. Are those also presented?
They are. So here's an example. Let me see. This thing is. So basically, what you can nest these things. So we have a Java gate, which is just simple logic that says when you have WebLogic security being used, then a nested decorator occurs, which is it's going to add this link to a access.redhat.com article. It's simply the links. They're meant to be simple. You just nest them within some sort of other gate. So, and along the way, if we do see WebLogic security, you also get these hints added. So if it's this WebLogic security class, you're going to migrate this to the security association put out. So you can see the hints themselves can either be attributes of the XML tag, or if you're getting more fancy where you're doing markdown, then you just put it in the body of the hint tag. So that's the main elements of Windup. I'm going to kind of switch into talking about migration methodology itself. I'll go ahead and kind of address a roadmap. We actually currently have a contribution for Windup to do C and C++ source code just like we do with Java. So when we merge this in, if you run Windup on C or C++ code for Unix to Linux migrations, we'll also be adding rules for that pretty soon. We're working on a Sonar plugin in order to add Windup to a continuous integration environment. We already have Maven plugins, and we already are. Actually, we'll probably launch the Eclipse plugin this week.
So the Sonar plugin is like you like to burn down before you get.
What's that?
So the Sonar plugin like wasn't already built you burn down before you get.
Exactly. Because Windup itself is a framework for, it produces these reports, but it's also an API. We split that out and made it modular. So any information that Windup itself puts in its reports, you can get from the Windup API directly. And that's why we're trying to encourage people to do a lot of mashups here, right? Because we have the content, we might as well leverage it. Pull in from the API things like effort, areas of interest, and present it all in Sonar. We're also going to be targeting rule migrations. iLog to BRMS are actually happening quite often. There's a lot of people migrating right now. BPM migrations and the SOA migrations are kind of an interesting one. The Red Hat itself, this started as a WebLogic to JBoss or WebSphere to JBoss, and actually we're going to start leveraging it internally for doing JBoss to JBoss, right? JBoss 4 to JBoss 5, JBoss 5 to JBoss 6. Those type of rules can be added very easily through Windup. And the SOA team has picked that up, and their labs that they did at Red Hat Summit this year were with Windup. We'll also be supporting the community, and we're going to be adding multi-pass processing so that you can take two files, write a rule that combines the output, to something useful in the report. So we'll be adding that. We're also going to be starting to add class loader support. So in other words, we're going to try to make it so that it's not a guess when you load your application through Windup, exactly what class not found exceptions you may encounter, what libraries are available within JBoss that conflict with the libraries you have in your application. Also, the appropriate JBoss modules that you need to include for JBoss 6. So we're working on that right now. There's a lot of graph theory there. Support for target platforms. So class loader for JBoss 6 is different from the class loader for JBoss 5. So adding support for that as well. And resources pulled to the top of the report. So if your application requires JMS, caching, database, we should be able to find that out from the application. If it has a persistence.xml, what is the database it's using, and those type of things. Bringing it to the top of the report will help you plan what resources need to be added to your new platform before you get started. And you can actually contribute yourself. So if you have rules that you write along the way, we would be happy to roll them back into Windup. Windup's open source, so you can go to github.com/Windup. The sub-project for the main Windup section is /Windup. So switching into methodology, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. A lot of people kind of consider Windup to solve the problem for them of migrating. But you got to understand that migrating is about a lot more than just migrating a platform. It's not just migrating some source code that now deploys in JBoss. You have to actually migrate your processes and your people as well. So processes are things like your build processes and your deployment processes. Large enterprise has these that they've built up over many years. A lot of automated pipelines to do these deployments or move them from their test to their production, right? You got to think about all that, and you've got to really plan for all of that along the way, so that when you have your application migrated into JBoss, you have the supporting processes and the supporting people skills in order to take that all the way through to production. Planning for successful migrations themselves, generally you need these 4 things in order to have a successful migration. Planning is key. If you don't understand all the pieces and the people that are going to bring this to fruition, then you're actually going to fail quite quickly. Participation is the team members that you identify. So this is the business owners, the testing team, the developers, the operations team. You have to have participation from all of those groups in order to have a successful migration. And along the way, participation is one thing. You can get your developers to participate, but if they're not communicating upstream, then for large migrations, they will fail, because you would have an application that gets migrated and no testing team to receive that application and no box to deploy it to, right? Communication along the way is extremely important, and the follow-through is extremely important. What I mean by that is, along the way, in large migrations where there's tens or potentially hundreds of applications that get migrated, there are always going to be new business requirements that come up along the way, midstream of your application migration. And there has to be somebody from the business that's standing above this and says, you know what, right now we're going to wait on the migration, we're going to let the new features come in, we're going to deploy them out to WebSphere or WebLogic, whatever you had before, and then we're going to continue, we're going to merge that code into your existing work stream and see it all the way through to JBoss. That follow-through is extremely critical. I'm going to break these down a little bit. Planning is key. As part of planning, when you're planning for an application migration, you should be not just looking at the applications and where they live in your source code repository, but also what applications are interrelated that you can migrate together. Because a lot of times if you have an EJB, a remote EJB, and 2 WebLogic applications, and you migrate one of them in legacy WebLogic land, it will not communicate with a JBoss application. You have to have this type of planning. Understand where your application interdependencies are. Web services are another one. Legacy web service endpoints, a lot of times they don't follow spec. So migrating them together when you can is a good idea. You're not just migrating one app. A lot of times you may have multiple apps going in that same work stream that are interrelated. Determine who is critical to the success of the application. That's not just the business user and the developer and the operations team. A lot of times in large business, especially if you're in finance or you're in healthcare, right, there's a lot of processes outside of that from a testing standpoint, SOX compliance, right? These type of compliance issues that you have to think about and plan for and get the teams all coordinated so that when you have an application come down, all the team members are ready to see it all the way through. You have to determine your deployment schedules and your development schedules. And what I mean by that is, you may have an app that currently has new business requirements coming that you need to hold off on the migration, push another app forward, and let that finish before you start the migration. Determine infrastructure needs. Obviously, that's one of the first things that you're going to do. You're planning with the infrastructure team to make sure the boxes are there. And I'll go through some Excel spreadsheets that we actually use at Red Hat Consulting to support that. And we actually use for the infrastructure team as well, the operations team, we use questionnaires along the way that I'll be providing on Windup's website. You also need to determine the processes that exist within the organization, and this is what I was saying before with build and deployment processes. And go ahead and plan and have a team working on just migrating the processes in parallel to the applications so that you can move the applications all the way through using this new modified process. And determine the skills that the team members will need to actually maintain the environments moving forward. If you're doing a migration, you need to make sure that the team members have the appropriate training, both from a development and an operations side, to support the application when it gets into production. Else, your business users aren't going to be happy, right? So, from a process standpoint at Red Hat Consulting, how we actually handle this is normally we take all applications. So if it's 5 applications, if it's 100 applications, and we run Windup against all the applications. The nice thing about Windup is, even if the report gets you a story point effort that is not a 100% accurate, it still will give you a very good idea of the level of effort. If you look at 100 applications, you can very quickly, for the most part, determine the low-hanging fruit. And I always say to customers, start with the low-hanging fruit. Find the ones that are easy. If it's an easy app to migrate, then use those extra resources to help with the operations and the build process migration as well, so that that one easy application gets all the way through to production. And when you've vetted that process, then you can start taking harder applications on and harder applications on. And along the way, you should be building the windup rules, because migrations that you've done along the way, if it's documented in windup and now you run it against the next application, you're going to have the answer in line, and it's just a matter then of following those steps. So windup itself is not just a tool, it's a platform for you to allow knowledge to snowball. Otherwise, you're starting from scratch on the same exact migration every single time. So as a community, when we build a community around this, every time somebody contributes something, this is one less problem that you're having to solve for the migration the next time through. And from that, we're also grouping the applications. So through the infrastructure questionnaires, figuring out, working with the application teams to define the integration points between the applications, finding the low-hanging fruit that are similar technologies. These two applications use Hibernate 2.x, or these two applications both use messaging, and migrating them together, because the problems that you're going to have to solve are going to be the same for application A and B, so it's going to be very quick for you to migrate at the same time. Analyze your infrastructure. This is, figuring out from a box standpoint, what is the capacity of the box that the existing application is running on? What are the JVM settings? What are your monitoring requirements for the application? Making sure that you understand from a platform perspective what needs to be in place before you start migrating. Define ownership. Figure out the people that own the applications. In a large enterprise where you have hundreds of applications, obviously there's going to be many groups involved. And that is both from a business standpoint, but also from a testing standpoint. If you have a large organization with multiple testing units, or like I said before, you have compliance units that need to come into play, you have to go ahead and define that and know who they are up front, so that when you get to the communication and participation, that everybody's at the table. Migration process. This is about leveraging windup. This is pretty much what I said before. You're going to bucket the applications into groups after running windup against all of them. Schedule them, keeping in mind the existing requirement schedules for new feature sets being added to the application. You really don't want to take on new requirements in addition to doing the migration. Because as soon as you get to your testing team and they say, this is a bug and this is from the migration, you can say, it's not from the migration, this is a new feature request. You don't want to mix where problems are coming from. Make it so that the exact same features can be running in parallel in both WebLogic and JBoss. Because if you need to fall back, if you do have some flaw in the JBoss migration and you need to fall back, you should have them both running in parallel, at least your initial application migrations, and just use a load balancer to switch between the stacks. When take 10% to your JBoss instances. When you're happy, take 50%. When you're happier, take 100%. If you don't hit any issues, retire your WebLogic stack. If you don't take on new requirements, you can do those type of deployment plans, which will help you in case issues do arise during runtime. And in parallel, I said you're going to be analyzing the infrastructure. From a process analysis standpoint, these are some areas of process analysis that you would want to consider. Do you have specialized Ant build tasks? Do you have standard ways of building the application outside of standard build tools? Is code getting generated by some library that is no longer going to exist in JBoss? Is it self-contained as far as the war or the ear file, or are there libraries that are outside of the application always deployed to the app server? Windup's not going to find that right now. In the future, it will. What server infrastructure is being used? What are the HA requirements? That's extremely important. How many servers do you have up? Do you have session replication happening between the servers? Is it stateless? Like, these type of things are to build the environments are going to be extremely important. How's the system monitored? How's the system provisioned? What are your current testing standards? What testing frameworks are you using? Do you have unit tests? Do you need to build those unit tests to fulfill the business's needs before actually migrating? These are all ideas you need to consider when migrating and figuring out effort. People analysis from the team perspective. Your development team needs to build the skills in order to develop against the new system. The testing team needs to have the skills to unit test against. So systems like continuous integration systems, if they were set up for WebLogic, they need to be set up for JBoss to support the testing team, for example. Operations-wise, skills to deploy and maintain the applications along the way. And there's training for each different group, and also consulting and partners in order to help us out. And then from migration process side, Excel spreadsheets to take applications and fill out relevant information in one place. And this way, when we're ready to do the migration, we can pass these documents out to every group, the testing, the operations, the business. And everybody is understanding the applications, the grouping that they're going to migrate in, who the appropriate business contacts are along the way. And then from a infrastructure standpoint, go ahead and work with the infrastructure team to set the hardware up ahead of time. Build your golden image of JBoss that's going to meet the business's needs. Thinking about things like security standards and modules that you have for databases. Have them ready for and set up so that the operations team can fill in a spreadsheet along the way that says, these are the actual IP addresses of the boxes that you're going to migrate to. They've already been set up with RHEL and with JBoss, and you're good to go. Just deploy your app out there, right? You want to set these things up ahead of time. If you don't, you're going to migrate an application. You're going to get 5 applications to the testing team. Who's going to go, I didn't know these were coming. They're going to get stuck in testing. New requirements will come down, and all of your work to migrate the application will be for naught, because the business's need for requirements definitely are the most important thing to business. They'll want to push out new requirements along the way. This is all just to keep you from having any roadblocks. And then from this perspective, this is just general planning from a time perspective. Make sure that you're doing the things like either team stand-ups between all of those people involved in that we documented here in the first slide, so that they know when you're giving this spreadsheet and passing it around, or you're using some sort of planning software to coordinate the dates which each team will receive the apps. Like I said, things aren't left uncompleted there. That's the methodology behind migrations. I'll make the documents available. The Excel spreadsheets that we actually use don't fit on the slides, but I'll show it to you real quick. Everybody can feel free to contact me. These are my Twitter handles. We have the team members on JBoss Windup. On the web, you can just hit, and this actually has pre-compiled JBoss Windup. Yes, it's open source, but we want the community to focus on writing the rules, not tinkering in the code, because we think that people that are doing migrations, you want to write the rules as quickly as possible. So we do provide it as a pre-compiled application available here. You can still get into the rules themselves and mash them up as much as you want. And you can find the source code itself at GitHub. First of all, are there any questions before I kind of go into some of the other material? Yes. The interesting thing behind Windup is the way that we go about the problem. It actually lends itself well to migrations, even if we don't have any rules at all. And the reason I say that is it is going to pull out relevant information to the top here for most of the JE standard type things. But more than anything, it's overly broad in its application of patterns. It will always pull any class that uses JBoss to the top of the report. So even if you're using an existing JBoss class, you can run Windup against it, and you'll see all of your classes that depend on JBoss classes. Now, they may not have an inline hint on what to do with that, but just the simple task of identifying what may need to be migrated saves a ton of time. So it will help you focus down on that. We are actively writing rules against that. There also is if you go to JBoss, there's a whole migration space that has documentation on migration from JBoss 5 to JBoss 6 as well. And that team is actively involved with Windup. So as they produce more material, the Windup team consumes that material and produces rules. So the Migration Center, if you just search for like JBoss Migration Center, open questions there. We have a forum that's monitored. So along the way, if you have any problems, just let us know. Yeah, it will help. It absolutely will help. Class loader is definitely something we have in our roadmap to help simplify quite a bit. The class loader in 6 is much more flexible than 5, so it already has an isolated class loader out of the box, so you can override the classes that are container classes with your classes a lot easier than you could in 5. But in the future, Windup will produce a report that kind of shows you, hey, these classes are conflicting with 6, and these are the modules that you would want to include. You used to have a huge mountain of effort just to figure out what you're using. Now it's negligible. You saw how quickly the report was generated, only 20 seconds, right? A lot of apps, even the largest apps, seem to only take about 2 or 3 minutes to run. To give that to a solutions architect or to give it to a Red Hat consultant person and have them help you along just to get started, it will not take much time at all. So leverage your support team, though. Yeah, and actually along the way, I didn't mention this, but one nice thing that Windup is also doing is cataloging all JDK deprecations. So just like we're giving inline hints here for WebLogic things, if we find something that was deprecated in an earlier JDK, we'll also give inline hints and add effort to that migration. And if you want to go to, you want to try it yourself with the stuff that I've generated or play around with adding rules, Go to the Windup website, windup.jboss.org. Go to download, and both the sample app that I ran is already compiled here. You can just pull it down and pull down Windup itself precompiled and run it against that sample app, and you should get that report out. And also that report is available here under the demo section. So you can explore the report without even having to generate it yourself. And then under guides, if there's people that you think would be interested in Windup, but they weren't able to make it tonight because of Atlanta traffic, then you can actually go in underneath the guides. There are 3 videos that are pretty quick. One's on writing rules. One's on just what the whole concept behind Windup itself. And the third is going through the demo report so that you can understand and you can show people, hey, this is what the report really means. So yeah, go forth, and if you have any questions, let me know.